The jungle looked as if it had been drained of its own life. Smoke drifted low between the trees, wrapping itself around the charred remains of a village that had once echoed with children's voices. Now the only sound was the brittle crackle of cooling embers and the distant thud of artillery, like a heartbeat that refused to quiet. Private Hiroshi Tanaka moved through the ruins with the slow caution of someone expecting the earth itself to betray him. He had been ordered to search for maps, anything that might reveal hidden American supply routes, but the weight of the mission felt strangely hollow. Every hut he stepped into told the same story: burnt walls, scattered belongings, silhouettes of lives interrupted in an instant. War had a way of turning entire homes into ash before a man even blinked. Hiroshi tried to keep his mind disciplined, focused, but the air tasted of grief, and his thoughts wandered to places he could not control. In the corner of a collapsed hut, a scrap of color caught his eye. At first he mistook it for debris, some melted fabric or bright shell, but when he knelt and brushed the ash away, he realized it was paper, a child's drawing, half burnt, edges curled but stubbornly alive. A sun with uneven rays, a family holding hands, a house drawn too small, a sky drawn too large. Nothing symmetrical, nothing perfect, except the innocence behind it. Hiroshi froze, struck by a contrast so sharp it felt like a hand closing around his chest. All around him lay the wreckage of adult hatred, yet here, in the ashes, a child had left proof that the world once had softer places. He lifted the drawing gently, afraid it might crumble in his fingers. It didn't. Even fire had not been able to destroy it completely. He knew he should drop it. Soldiers were warned not to carry unnecessary items. Yet something in the crooked smile of the drawn child held him still. It reminded him, too suddenly, too painfully, of his own daughter's early sketches, sent from home before the mail stopped coming. For a moment the war around him thinned, becoming less a battlefield and more a distant storm he had wandered into by mistake. He folded the drawing carefully and tucked it into his uniform, as if it were something fragile he had been entrusted to protect. He didn't understand why, not yet, only that in a place where everything seemed to be dying, this small piece of color refused to surrender. And without knowing it, Hiroshi felt the first quiet pull of a mystery that would follow him far beyond the jungle's smoke. Night settled over the encampment like a heavy lid, dimming the world to the low glow of lanterns and smoldering cook fires. Hiroshi sat on an overturned ammunition crate, boots still damp from the jungle, muscles aching with that familiar blend of exhaustion and dread. Around him, men played cards, sharpened bayonets, traded rumors, anything to drown out the thoughts that came too easily when the guns went quiet. He waited until no one was looking before sliding a hand into his breast pocket. The paper felt warm against his chest, as if it had absorbed something of his heartbeat. He unfolded it carefully, smoothing the wrinkles with his thumb. Even in the weak lantern light, the bright sun and smiling figures stood out with a child's earnest confidence, a world without fear, sketched by someone who had not yet learned what war could take. It clashed sharply with everything he had been taught. Back in training, they were told the island people were treacherous, unpredictable, barely human. Animals, one instructor had said. They pretend to be peaceful, then stab you when you sleep. The soldiers accepted it because fear was easier when it had a face, and easier still when that face was not fully human. But the drawing refused to fit that story. It was too simple, too honest. There was no hatred in it, no hint of the monstrous enemy they had been warned about, just a family, a house, a son, the universal grammar of childhood. A shadow fell across him. "Tanaka," a voice barked, half amused, half annoyed. "What's that you're staring at? A love letter?"
3 men crowded around him before he could hide the page. Their laughter was immediate, sharp, cutting through the night. One snatched the drawing and held it up. "A child's scribble? Are you serious?" Another shook his head. "Careful, next he'll name it and call it his friend." Their jokes were not cruel, but they carried the casual hardness of men clinging to whatever armor kept them sane. To them, sentiment was weakness, and weakness was dangerous. Hiroshi forced a smile, reached forward, and reclaimed the drawing with more urgency than he intended. The men didn't notice. They were already moving on, laughter trailing behind them like smoke. When they were gone, he folded the paper again, slower this time, almost reverent, and hid it deep beneath his uniform. It felt like a secret now, something he had to protect, not only from war, but from his own comrades. A small act of rebellion, quiet and invisible, yet powerful enough to unsettle him. For the first time, he wondered which version of the world was true, the one painted by propaganda or the one a child had drawn from simple, unquestioning trust. Dawn erupted without light, only a dull gray that seeped into the jungle like a weary breath. Rain hammered the earth, turning pathways into rivers of mud. Hiroshi crouched in a shallow trench with his rifle across his knees, listening to the distant thunder of artillery rolling over the hills. Each blast felt closer than the last, vibrating through the soaked ground and up into his bones. He tried to focus on the rhythm of the rain, but the jungle was a living thing, restless and unpredictable. Mortar fire cracked somewhere ahead, sending a ragged tremor through the trees. The men pressed deeper into the mud, as if the earth could swallow their fear. Hiroshi clutched the front of his uniform, feeling the faint outline of the folded drawing beneath the fabric. That small, fragile square of paper had become something he couldn't explain. It wasn't just a child's sketch anymore. It was a reminder of a world that existed beyond the mud, beyond the brutality, beyond the endless nights where survival felt like an insult rather than a blessing.
Another explosion lit the horizon. Mud splattered his face, cold and heavy. And in that moment, amid the trembling earth, the roaring sky, and the metallic tang of fear, his mind slipped away from the battlefield. He saw his daughter. Not as she would be now, years older, but as she was the day he left. Bright-eyed, hair tied with a red ribbon, small chalk lines smeared across her hands from the pictures she drew on their tatami floor. She had drawn suns, too. Big ones, lopsided ones, suns that crowded the edges of the paper because she always believed there should be more light than space. Her laughter used to fill the house like wind chimes after a storm, fragile yet healing. The memory struck him with unexpected force, clearer than anything the war had left him. He tasted the soft warmth of those scenes, remembered the weight of her small hand gripping his thumb, the way she tried to imitate the way he held a pencil. She drew clumsily, proudly, as if every crooked line was a masterpiece. Then the memory shifted, frayed at the edges. The house dissolved into smoke, the tatami blurred, the colors drained like water swirling down a drain. He tried to grasp the image, hold it steady, but war had a way of tearing memories apart, pulling them thread by thread until only shadows remained. He blinked, and the jungle returned. Cold, wet, unforgiving. Another shell landed nearby, shaking loose a rain of leaves. A soldier next to him cursed loudly, scrambling for his helmet. The world demanded his attention again, dragging him back into its violence. Hiroshi pressed a trembling hand over the hidden drawing. It grounded him, anchoring him to something he feared he was losing, the memory of being a father, not just a soldier. War had begun to replace his daughter's face with terror, replacing her laughter with gunfire. But this drawing, bright, uneven, impossibly innocent, refused to let her fade. And in that stubborn scrap of color, Hiroshi felt something like defiance stir within him. Not against the enemy, but against the war itself. The retreat began without warning. No shouted orders, no trumpet of command, only the sudden, terrifying ripple of men realizing the line had collapsed. One moment, Hiroshi was crouched behind a fallen palm, listening for movement. The next, soldiers were sprinting past him through the underbrush, mud flying from their boots, faces twisted with the raw panic of men who knew the jungle no longer belonged to them. Gunfire cracked from the ridgeline, scattering flocks of birds into the smoky air. Someone yelled his name, another urged him to run, but the jungle swallowed most voices, turning them into echoes that came from everywhere and nowhere. Hiroshi grabbed his pack and stumbled forward, branches slashing at his arms as he pushed through the tangled path. The air burned with the smell of cordite and wet earth. A mortar shell exploded close enough to lift him off his feet. He hit the ground hard, vision flashing white, ears ringing with a piercing whine. When he reached for his pack, his hand closed on empty air. The blast had torn it free, flinging it somewhere into the chaos behind him. The loss stung, his letters, his rations, the last pieces of home. But another burst sent soil raining over him, and instinct screamed at him to move. He staggered upright, only to realize his rifle was gone too, torn from his grip when he fell. Without it, he felt exposed, naked, like a man suddenly stripped of his purpose. He scanned the ground, searching desperately, but the jungle floor was a frenzied blur of running boots, broken branches, and smoke. Another explosion shook the earth. He had seconds, maybe less. He pressed a hand to his chest, expecting to feel nothing there either. But beneath the soaked fabric, he felt it, the faint, unmistakable rustle of folded paper. The drawing. Something inside him tightened. Not fear, not helplessness, but a strange, fragile clarity. He had lost everything a soldier was supposed to carry, yet the one thing he saved wasn't meant for war at all. It was meant for life. Hiroshi turned and ran with the others, branches whipping across his face, breath burning in his throat. Men shouted behind him, some falling, some refusing to rise. The jungle roared with fire, but he kept a hand pressed to his chest, shielding the paper as if it were a living thing. The absurdity wasn't lost on him. He no longer fought for the emperor, or for territory, or for the glory printed in military handbooks. He fought for a son drawn in uneven strokes, for a family sketched with hope instead of hate, for a memory of his daughter that war had tried to erase. And when he finally slowed to catch his breath, miles from where the line had broken, Hiroshi realized his priorities had shifted without his permission. He was no longer running to survive. He was running to protect the last untouched fragment of humanity he still possessed. And for the first time, that felt like enough. By the time Hiroshi's unit was overtaken, the fight had already drained out of them. Hunger had hollowed their cheeks, exhaustion bowed their backs, and the distant thunder of American artillery felt less like a threat and more like an ending they could no longer outrun. When the Americans finally appeared through the trees, helmets low, rifles raised, no one resisted. The jungle that once urged them to hide now whispered surrender. Hiroshi lifted his shaking hands, fingers caked with mud, and waited for whatever came next. Propaganda had painted this moment in grisly colors: torture, humiliation, slow death disguised as mercy. But the Americans moved with brisk efficiency rather than cruelty, disarming the
prisoners were moved with practiced caution. One soldier took Hiroshi's empty hands and guided them behind his head, checking him for weapons. Another pulled him toward the clearing where the others were being gathered. The POW camp was rough. Tents worn from rain, fences patched with rusted wire. But it was not the hell he had been taught to expect. Guards shouted, yes, but not with malice. Prisoners were pushed, not beaten. And when a wounded Japanese corporal collapsed from dehydration, an American medic hurried over, kneeling in the dirt without hesitation. Hiroshi watched, stunned, as the medic cleaned the corporal's wound, speaking in a tone too soft to match the war he belonged to. It felt impossible. He had been told Americans were monsters. Yet here was one pressing bandages with gentleness, brow furrowed in concern. The world wavered. Something he had believed for years cracked quietly inside him. Later, as the prisoners lined up for food, Hiroshi stood apart, clutching the front of his uniform where the drawing rested. He had kept it hidden through retreat, fire, and capture. But now, as he reached for a ladle of watery soup, the medic from earlier paused in front of him. Hiroshi stiffened. The medic's eyes drifted to the faint outline of the folded paper beneath Hiroshi's jacket. Without thinking, Hiroshi covered it with his hand. The medic's gaze softened, not with pity, but with recognition, with understanding. For a moment, neither spoke. They couldn't. Language split them like a river they had no bridge for. But something older than words passed between them. The quiet knowledge that war had lied to both sides, that humanity was not a uniform, a flag, or a command shouted across an ocean. The medic gave a small nod, almost apologetic, and handed Hiroshi the soup. A gesture so ordinary, it became extraordinary. And as Hiroshi walked back to the tent, the drawing warm against his chest, he felt the first fragile thread between enemies, thin, uncertain, but undeniably human. The war ended not with a bang he witnessed, but with a silence that reached him weeks later, carried through rumors, then confirmed by the tight-lipped American officers who no longer barked orders with urgency. Surrender. The word felt unreal, weightless, like a feather drifting through a room full of broken glass. Hiroshi did not know whether to feel relief or guilt. Neither emotion offered him rest. The POWs were transferred to a repatriation camp, a place of long lines, thin blankets, and endless waiting. They waited for food, for news, for transport home. But mostly they waited for themselves to return. Men once certain of their duty, now hollowed by what they had seen, done, or failed to do. In that limbo, letters became a kind of fragile medicine. The camp officers encouraged prisoners to write to families, reassuring them of survival. Hiroshi sat at a crude wooden desk beneath a dim bulb and watched other men weep silently as they tried to form words for wives and children they weren't sure still existed. He dipped his brush into the ink, pausing over the blank page. At first, he wrote to his wife, apologies wrapped in cautious hope. Then to his daughter, questions he feared had no answers. But another letter took shape as days passed, one he never expected to write. It was addressed not to family, but to the unknown child from the burned village. He wrote slowly, carefully, afraid the ink might betray the tremble in his hands. He told the child how he found the drawing in the ashes, how it followed him through the jungle, how it survived fire, rain, and every attempt the world made to turn him into something unfeeling. He admitted that he had protected it more fiercely than his rifle, more fiercely at times than his own hope. He wrote that the drawing reminded him of his daughter when memory faltered, that it helped him remember he was still human, even on days when he no longer believed it. But with each line, shame thickened around him like fog. What right did he have to speak to that child? He had been part of the force that brought terror to the island, even if he had not intended harm. His presence alone had carved scars into places he could never name. The drawing had saved him, yet he feared the child who made it might see him as the reason it needed saving in the first place. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully, as if the paper might bruise. Then he tucked it with the drawing inside the cloth pouch he kept close, beneath his jacket. He never submitted it with the others. Months later, when he finally boarded the ship back to Japan, a defeated nation rising from the ashes of its own, he carried the letter and the drawing with him. Years would pass, homes rebuilt. His daughter grew taller, his hair grew thinner, but he never parted with either scrap of paper. They remained folded together in his drawer, quiet and unresolved. A scar he chose not to heal because he believed he hadn't earned the right. By 1965, Japan hummed with a new kind of energy. Neon signs flickered over crowded train platforms, factories roared with life, and entire neighborhoods rose from foundations that 20 years earlier had been nothing but rubble. Everywhere Hiroshi looked, the country seemed determined to outrun its past. But he moved through it quietly, a man rebuilt only on the outside. He worked in a textile factory where the machines clattered in steady rhythms, drowning out memories he had spent years trying to bury. His co-workers joked about baseball scores, television dramas, the latest gadgets from America. Hiroshi smiled when appropriate, nodded politely, but rarely spoke unless spoken to. People assumed he was simply reserved. They never guessed how much of him was still stranded in the jungle.
Every morning before work, he placed his worn wallet into his jacket. Inside it, folded with almost ritualistic care, lay the drawing. The paper was soft now, its edges feathered from decades of being carried next to his heart. He never opened it in public. He barely opened it in private. But he needed to know it was there, proof of something that refused to fade even as the city around him transformed into steel and electricity. One rainy evening, his daughter came to visit. She was a young woman now, confident, sharp-eyed, working in an office that seemed to exist in a different world than the one he had survived. As she reached for his wallet to hand it to him, the drawing slipped out and fluttered to the tatami like a leaf losing its grip. She picked it up gently. "Father, what is this?" For a long moment, Hiroshi stared at the paper in her hands, unable to answer. The years compressed inside him. Jungle mud, gunfire, smoke, silence. Then, with a breath that felt decades overdue, he told her. Not quickly, not cleanly, but with the halting honesty of a man opening a wound he had learned to live with. He described the village, the fire, the retreat, the medic, the letter he never sent. His daughter listened without interrupting, eyes softening as the pieces of her father she never understood finally aligned. When he finished, she held the drawing to her chest. "You should return this," she said quietly. "Someone out there lost it long ago, and maybe they lost more than this." The modern world buzzed outside. Cars, voices, progress. But inside the small room, time stood still. Hiroshi felt the weight of the paper in his daughter's hands and realized that while Japan had rebuilt everything around him, he had rebuilt nothing inside himself. Her words were simple, yet they opened a door he had kept nailed shut for 20 years. A memory needed returning, and perhaps so did he. He began the search the next morning, though he felt unprepared for every step. The drawing lay on the table between him and his daughter, like a fragile witness, urging him forward. With her help, he drafted letters, first to municipal offices, then to war archives, then to veterans associations who might recognize the village from his scattered memories. Each letter felt like reaching into the past with bare hands, uncertain what he might touch. Weeks turned into months. Responses trickled in, polite but unhelpful. Most records from the island had been destroyed. Some officials apologized for their inability to assist. Others simply did not remember. Still, Hiroshi persisted, writing to missionaries who had served in the region, and even to American veterans who might recall the families displaced during the fighting. Every envelope sealed carried both hope and dread. Every envelope opened returned silence. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived from a historian in Kagoshima, a man who had spent years documenting the civilian losses on Pacific Islands.
He had read Hiroshi's account with interest and compared the description of the drawing's style with surviving school records. One family had lived near the burned village. The father had been a fisherman. The mother sold woven baskets. They had 2 children. Both had survived the war, though their home had not. They still lived on the same island. Hiroshi stared at the words until they blurred. His hands trembled, not with joy, but with the sudden gravity of possibility. To know who the child was meant confronting the life he had touched unintentionally, the family he had once passed through like a shadow. What if they remembered only terror? What if he became the embodiment of everything they lost? His daughter placed her hand over his. "You don't know what they'll feel," she said gently, "but you know what you must do." He wrote to the family with the careful humility of a man stepping barefoot across old embers. He explained who he had been, how he came to find the drawing, and why he had carried it for 20 years. He asked for nothing, not forgiveness, not understanding, only the chance to return what was never his. For several weeks no reply came. Each day stretched long and tight, like the silent pause before a verdict. Then a small envelope appeared in his mailbox. The handwriting was uneven, as if the writer had hesitated before each stroke. Inside, a simple message: "We remember. We are willing to meet." No bitterness, no accusation, just willingness, a door opened a few inches, enough for light to pass through. As he packed his modest suitcase for the journey, his fingers shook. He folded the drawing with reverence, placing it between soft cloth as though it were a delicate relic. The ship ticket lay beside it, trembling slightly in his unsteady grip. He did not know if he was returning a treasure or reopening a scar. But for the first time in decades, he felt himself moving towards something rather than away. The island looked nothing like the battlefield Hiroshi carried in his memory. The tangled jungle had thinned into orderly fields, and the coastline, once scarred by shell fire, now shimmered quietly under a calm, forgiving sun. But as he stepped onto the narrow pier, a familiar heaviness settled over him, as if the soil itself remembered what he wished it would forget. A local official guided him along a dirt path toward a small farmhouse overlooking terraced hills. With each step, Hiroshi felt the years folding inward, returning him to the frightened young soldier who once moved through this land as an intruder. His hands tightened around the cloth bundle in his pocket, the drawing still pressed close to his heart.
The farmhouse door opened before he reached it. A man stepped out, broad-shouldered, sun-worn, carrying the quiet steadiness of someone who had spent a lifetime working the same earth. Hiroshi saw no trace of the child he had imagined for 20 years, yet something in the man's eyes, a brightness untouched by war, felt achingly familiar. They bowed, awkward at first, then deeply. Inside the house, they sat across from each other at a low wooden table. The air was thick with unspoken history. The farmer, once the child whose drawing Hiroshi had saved, waited patiently, hands resting calmly on his knees. Hiroshi spoke slowly, haltingly, his voice trembling as he described the burned village, the retreat, the fear that had swallowed him whole. He told how he found the drawing, how it stayed with him through fire and surrender, how it became the only proof he had left that the world still held innocence. The farmer listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, his silence neither welcoming nor cold, simply open. When Hiroshi finally unfolded the drawing and placed it on the table, the farmer leaned forward. His breath caught softly, as if recognizing a piece of time he had forgotten existed. He touched the paper gently, tracing the uneven sun, the crooked house, the family holding hands. "I drew this when I was very small. I didn't know it survived." Hiroshi bowed his head, ashamed of everything his presence once represented.
I am sorry for the fear, for the fire, for everything." But the farmer shook his head. "You kept something of mine safe when nothing else was safe. You honored it more than we ever did." They sat in quiet stillness, two men from opposite sides of a war that had tried to make them enemies. No speeches, no absolution, just the gentle exchange of a memory returned to its rightful owner. It was the kind of forgiveness the world never sees, quiet, fragile, and deeply human. Hiroshi left the farmhouse slowly, as if afraid the moment might vanish if he moved too quickly. Yet with each step down the path, something inside him eased, something tight and wordless that had lived in his chest for far too long. The drawing now returned to the hands that first created it, no longer tugged at him like an unanswered question. It had completed its journey, and in doing so, it had allowed him to complete his own. The afternoon light stretched long across the fields, warm and golden, softening the edges of everything it touched. He paused to look back at the house on the hillside. Once this landscape had been the setting of fear, fire, and confusion. Today it was simply a home. The war had tried to shape this island into an enemy. Time had patiently reshaped it back into a place where people lived, worked, and remembered differently. As he reached the pier, Hiroshi realized the memory he carried for 2 decades had transformed. It was no longer a mark of shame or a reminder of the boy he had been when the world demanded he act like a weapon. It had become something gentler, a bridge between lives separated by borders, languages, and the machinery of war. A reminder that even in the darkest places, small acts of humanity can survive like hidden embers. He boarded the ferry and found a seat by the railing. The wind was soft against his face, and the sea below shimmered with the calm of a world that had learned, painfully, how to rebuild itself. For the first time since he was a young soldier lost in the jungle, he felt unburdened. The story he had carried alone was now shared. The drawing he once protected as a lifeline had become a testament to something far larger than fear. As the island receded into the horizon, the narrative of his life shifted. He was no longer defined by the days he spent destroying, retreating, or surviving. Instead, he was defined by the one small thing he protected, a fragile piece of a child's hope that outlasted the war meant to erase it. The documentary ends not with triumph or tragedy, but with stillness, an invitation for the viewer to absorb its quiet truth. War divides people. Humanity, in its smallest gestures, stitches them together again.